Well, we're coming up on our end of sprint, and we're looking pretty good because a lot of our tasks we have cleaned up so far, so we're looking fairly well on track. We have started our GPS of plant screen, and so I'm going to move these over, a lot of these which we've completed. And normally I wouldn't move them all over at once. Normally we'd have a series of stand-ups between our work activities. But nonetheless, Sprint 1's now complete. What we want to do next is we want to do a retrospective. So I'm going to go to idea boards because they make it really easy for us to set up a retrospective. And just like so. And then I'm going to say, okay, let's go ahead and create my own idea board. And we're going to call this one 3048 Sprint 1 Retro and Sprint 1 Retro for programming mobile devices. And we will make this retrospective. And what went well, I also call this continue. So what do we want to continue doing? What can be improved? So maybe what do we want to stop doing? And action items, what do we want to start doing? And boom. And then create. And then this will give us a board where we can start posting some ideas like what went well? We met our sprint goal. Things like this. Okay, now what we can do, I'll ask you to go out and put a few things under this board yourself, and then after we have several submissions here, we'll go back and vote on 2 from each column of what went well, what can be improved, and what we want to start doing. So that's a ceremony that we'll typically do at the end of sprint. Now we're also starting a new sprint, so we need to think of things like handle GPS location. So we'll think of using some kind of fused location provider. We can either use the API, which has been deprecated, or the client. We'll look at a little bit of each, a little flavor of each of those. Okay, and then we need to handle location changing. Okay, we'll say update chronometer. Associate GPS with specimen. Okay. Turn off GPS when we leave the screen. Okay, and then we also want to turn on GPS when we enter the screen. And save. So a few things we're going to need to do there. For capture image of a plant, we're going to need things like request permissions, which actually we're going to need for GPS as well, so I'm glad I thought about that. We're going to need to invoke an intent, or invoke an activity via an implicit intent. Okay. We'll say receive the image. Or maybe we could even say store the image. Because for capturing an image, we're going to need to deal with the camera. So actually, let's change this one from activity to camera. A little more specific there, invoke a camera. This one can get a little tricky because we also have to set up something called a file provider. Which allows us to save the image. Maybe say associate, let's see, did we get that one? Associate image with specimen. And then we'll need to have some way to upload images, so on and so forth. Autocomplete plant names, for this we're going to need to read a JSON source of data, of plant name data. Okay, now just like with handling GPS location, we can do it one of 2 ways. We can create a traditional file stream and use the JSON object library, or we can use retrofit. So a couple different ways we can parse the JSON. We'll say parse. Okay. Now we're also going to need to do some things with a separate thread. Handle network on a separate thread, because we can't do networking on our main user interface thread. And then we also need to create a model that will link up to autocomplete text view. In other words, a model is a series of data that will be used as the filter criteria in this autocomplete. So as the user starts typing, it's going to check that against this model of data. Now where things get really interesting is determine which plant the user selected from the autocomplete. So autocomplete is one thing, but you need to know what the user actually typed in there. And then we also need to determine if the user typed in a plant name not yet known. Because in an autocomplete, the user could choose a pre-selected option, or the user could choose to type something new. So we have several things there. Save specimen, we'll hold that off until we get into a bit of Firebase. So I'll just put a note here, create Firebase database. So that's coming. But really in this sprint planning, we just want to focus on the stories that we're going to play in this sprint. And those are those stories. The first one we're going to play is going to be handle GPS location. I'm going to fast forward here a little bit and just say each one of these in this lecture is going to go from the not started state to the complete state. We have a really handy and hopefully educational lecture coming up. It's going to be a good one. A lot of, I would say, just about any mobile app does use GPS location, but the thing we have to consider is that the user can turn off GPS location as well. So with all this being said, let's go take a look at our learning module. So this learning module is called Location-Based Services. We see it goes over a lot of the things I just described in our Scrum board. The presentation's up at the top. A series of videos where we'll work through our normal examples. And then we have Location Services Videos discussion board. So if there's anything that's hot on your mind while you're watching the videos, feel free to post it out here on the discussion board where your fellow classmates and I can see this alike. One thing I will point out as we go through here, there's a little bit of information about interfaces and polymorphism. That's one of those concepts you might have heard about in intro computer programming, but it didn't make a whole lot of sense. In this learning module, we're going to give some examples that help to make it make sense. Additionally, it's really something that you need to know as an Android programmer because it's a fundamental part of Android programming. We'll talk about the builder design pattern in Google API Client and Fused Location API, which I mentioned is one way to do location services. We talk about the Android activity lifecycle, which is really important, even location services aside. The chronometer, which is like a countdown. How to pause and then unpause. Then we have a couple of videos where we look at a slightly different way to do locations. Instead of Fused Location Provider API, we use something called Fused Location Provider Client, which makes things a little bit easier. So in your project, feel free to use one or the other. Doesn't really matter to me because they both work. If you had to flip a coin, I would go with a newer one, which is the Fused Location Provider Client, just because it's a lot less typing and a lot less interfaces you have to deal with. Now, a little video on code review because code review is coming up soon. Check the calendar for details on that. Under assignments, of course, we have our quiz question suggestions, our code review. Check the calendar for when that's due. And then because we're at the end of sprint, we have our retrospective. And if I open up the link that you see here, it should look a little bit familiar. Let's try just like so and go to, and what do we have? Sure enough, this is the retrospective board that I just created. So this week, retrospective, quiz question suggestions in the quiz, and then keep an eye out for that code review on the calendar. So going to be a fun learning module. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.